So let us go to a shapeless memory. Can all of you find that? A shapeless memory lingers in us still. And sometimes, when our sight is turned within, Earth's ignorant veil is lifted from our eyes. There is a short, miraculous escape. Now, what is Sri Aurobindo telling us here? He's telling us that this memory that is lingering in us is shapeless. Well, it's shapeless because we don't remember where we came from anymore. We don't remember that we incarnated in a human body. But if we turn our sight within, this ignorant veil of earth, where we are presently in a human body, is lifted from our eyes. And therefore, there is a short, it doesn't last very long, miraculous escape. People, this word escape is not the escape that we normally associate with the definition of getting away from something, but it means being freed from something. And we are freed of this ignorant veil because we all live with this veil. Sri Aurobindo wrote to a disciple on his birthday about this veil. And he wrote, "A veil behind the heart, a lid over the mind, keep us from the divine. Love and devotion rend the veil, and in the quietude of the mind, the lid thins and vanishes." So this is what happens. Shapeless memory that's still lingering in us. It allows us, when we turn our sight within, to lift this ignorant veil of earth from our eyes, and we receive a short but miraculous escape. And then he begins again, continuing this same feeling, the same experience, this narrow fringe of clamped experience we leave behind, meted to us as life, our little walks, our insufficient reach. Well, of course, it is a narrow fringe of clamped experience, one lifetime. A fringe is something resembling an outer edge or a margin or a periphery. And clamped experience, clamped in this sense, Sri Aurobindo uses clamped often as an adjective, it's restricted or repressed. So this narrow margin of repressed experience, clamped experience, we leave behind. Meted is allotted to us as life. So we leave behind this life that is meted to us. So that way, the ignorant veil of earth is lifted from our eyes, and our sight is turned within. And there's this short, miraculous escape. Many of us have had this. Many of us have experienced this, maybe not only once, but a number of times. How have we experienced it? Well, sometimes perhaps in dream. At other times, we might have experienced it in in a moment when the inner lamps were lit and the life's cherished guests were left outside. Because the life's cherished guests are something that we live and experience every day. Our friends, our associations, our difficulties, our joys and griefs, etc. So now he says that when we do all of this, when we leave behind all of this that is meted to us as life, then our souls can visit in great lonely hours still regions of imperishable light, all-seeing eagle peaks of silent power and moon flame oceans of swift, fathomless bliss and calm immensities of spirit space. Now we have to look into a few definitions here because Sri Aurobindo capitalizes light and he capitalizes power and he capitalizes bliss. And these are, as I've often mentioned, extremely important. So let's look at these still regions of imperishable light. What does he say about light? Well, in the Life Divine, he writes, light is primarily a spiritual manifestation of the divine reality, illuminative and creative. Material light is a subsequent representation or conversion of it into matter for the purposes of the material energy. And then he has this wonderful, wonderful statement, which I may have read before, but I will read it again because it is so beautiful. And it is from the hour of God. Our sense, by its incapacity, has invented darkness. In truth, there is nothing but light. Only it is a power of light either above or below our poor human vision's limited range. For do not imagine that light is created by the suns. The suns are only physical concentrations of light, but the splendor they concentrate for us is self-born and everywhere. God is everywhere, and wherever God is, there is light. Now, in the Mother, he writes also, light is a general term. Light is not knowledge, but the illumination that comes from above and liberates the being from obscurity and darkness. And lastly, something I know that I've read to many of you before, because it was something that was written by Mother to my dear friend, Dimitri von Morenschild. And I have it right above me, in back of me, always to refer to it. Mother writes, the light is everywhere. The force is everywhere. And the world is so small. How beautiful. Now he continues, all-seeing eagle peaks of silent power. And we have to look at his definition of power from the letters on yoga, because he capitalizes here power again. And he writes, power means strength and force, Shakti, which enables one to face all that can happen and to stand and overcome. Also to carry out what the divine will proposes. It can include many things: power over men, events, circumstances, means, etc. But all this, not of the mental or vital kind, but by an action through unity of consciousness with the divine and with all things and beings. It is not an individual strength depending on certain personal capacities, but the divine power using the individual as an instrument. And Mother writes, the most usual form of power is control over things, person, events, forces. Then we get to the line that is just so beautiful. And moon flame oceans of swift, fathomless bliss. And Sri Aurobindo capitalizes bliss. And he writes in the Life Divine, for from the divine bliss, the original delight of existence, the Lord of immortality comes pouring the wine of that bliss, the mystic soma, into these jars of mentalized living matter, eternal and beautiful. He enters into these sheaths of substance for the integral transformation of the being and nature. And lastly, in the synthesis of yoga, he says, and this bliss is not a supreme pleasure of the heart and sensations, with the experience of pain and sorrow as its background, but a delight also self-existent and independent of objects and particular experiences, a self-delight, which is the very nature, the very stuff, as it were, of a transcendent and infinite existence. And he closes this thought, this passage with, and calm immensities of spirit space. Now he begins another great section, and I can read a little bit but there's much to discuss here. So much to discuss. So we will go through a little bit, and I'll read the passage first, and then we can go into Sri Aurobindo's explaining to us what it is. In the unfolding process of the self, sometimes the inexpressible mystery elects a human vessel of descent. Well, sometimes in this unfolding process of the self, he speaks of the self capital S again. And he says from the essays on the Gita, the self is our self-existent being. And in Letters on Yoga, he writes, the self is being, not a being. By self is meant the conscious, essential existence, one in all. And then he has two profound statements in the synthesis of yoga, which I wish to read to you. In relation to the individual, the supreme is our own true and highest self, that which ultimately we are in our essence, that of which we are in our manifested nature. A spiritual knowledge moved to arrive at the true self in us must reject, as the traditional way of knowledge rejects, all misleading appearances. It must discover that the body is not our self, our foundation of existence. It is a sensible form of the infinite. Our highest self, which possesses and supports this universal power, the divine will, is not our ego self, not our personal nature. It is something transcendent and universal, of which these smaller things are only foam and flowing surface. How important that is for us to remember, that this highest self, which he capitalizes even in his statement on the synthesis of yoga, which possesses and supports this universal power, capital P for power, which is the divine will, in parentheses, is not our ego self, not our personal nature. What is it? It is something transcendent and universal, of which these smaller things are only foam and flowing surface. And that is why Mother is so insistent that we contact our psychic being to learn of our true self. In the Life Divine, he writes, the self, capital S again, is a fundamental aspect of Brahman, but with a certain stress on its impersonality. And then a long passage, relatively long, from the Life Divine that we should hear. As soon as we become aware of the self, we are conscious of it as eternal, unborn, unembodied, uninvolved in its workings. It can be felt within the form of being, but also as enveloping it, as above it, surveying its embodiment from above, adyaksa. It is omnipresent, the same in everything, infinite and pure and intangible forever. This self, again a capital S, can be experienced as the self of the individual, the self of the thinker, doer, enjoyer. But even so, it always has this greater character. Its individuality is at the same time a vast universality, or very readily passes into that. And the next step to that is a sheer transcendence, or a complete and ineffable passing into the absolute. The self is that aspect of the Brahman, in which it is intimately felt as at once individual, cosmic, transcendent of the universe. The realization of the self is the straight and swift way towards individual liberation, ecstatic universality, a nature transcendence. At the same time, there is a realization of self in which it is felt not only sustaining and pervading and enveloping all things, but constituting everything, and identified in a free identity with all its becomings in nature. Even so, freedom and impersonality are always the character of the self. There is no appearance of subjection to the workings of its own power in the universe, such as the apparent subjection of the Purusha to Prakriti. To realize the self is to realize the eternal freedom of the spirit. And in the letters on yoga, he writes, it is the soul, the inner being, that is the true self in everyone. And I think we have gone to our time limit. And we will pick up this unfolding process of the self next week, because sometimes the inexpressible mystery elects a human vessel of descent. Now, we didn't do so many lines today, but they're very, very important. Thank you so much, and namaste, everyone. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Namaste.
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 Namaste. Namaste.
Thank you so much.
Namaste.
Thank you.